It would be one of the most complex machines ever built. It would take 10,000 people and nearly 5 years to build it. It would cost an estimated $5 billion. Success was anything but certain. The plane would contain more than 4 million parts, supplied by contractors around the world. But would they arrive on time?
Miss your first commitment and then things start to go wrong.
And would they work?
From a technical point of view, I would not put this back on the airplane if I had a choice.
Nothing could be left to chance.
154.
This would be the most tested airliner in aviation history. Eventually, lives would be at stake.
There's an apprehension anytime you change technology.
To make it all work, the company would reinvent itself from the inside out. And all of this would have to happen at a time when the world's airline industry was in recession. If the 777 were to fail, the company's future was at risk. Success would keep Boeing ahead of the competition for decades to come. This plane would be built to set a new standard for commercial aviation. This is the story of the building of a 21st century jet. (1993) had been the year of assembly for Boeing's new airliner, the 777. In the space of a year, a whole plane had come together in the factory. By January of 1994, the plane was moving for the first time on its own wheels. It was a delicate operation. A team of wing walkers made sure the tow driver avoided bumping into walls, tools, or other aircraft.
Because I can't see the end of the wing tips. If I get close to something, they'll let me know, warn me, or we have to back up and try again.
Boeing had so far received orders for 140 planes. They hoped the 777 would ensure the company's commercial success well into the 21st century. But no 777 had yet flown. This one would be the first, and there were only 5 months to go before this aircraft would take its first flight. It would be 5 months of pressure, stress, and shifting deadlines. This plane marked a change of direction for Boeing. It had been built with the latest technology, new flight testing, and a pioneering new management philosophy. Now, the plane was ready for those who would prepare it for its first flight. Now that a space had been vacated, the number 2 plane would be moved into position for assembly, followed by other planes farther down the line. There was one important component still missing from the plane. In fact, 2. The engines. They were being designed and manufactured by other companies and would be brought to the plane just a few weeks before rollout. Boeing makes airplanes, but they don't make airplane engines. That requires a technology all its own. Pressure to design and test the 777 engines would dominate the run-up to the first flight. Granville Frazier was the Boeing executive responsible for working with the engine manufacturers. Raised on a farm in Mississippi, he was known to his colleagues as Granny.
Did it change anything from the meeting we had this morning?
When I used to go back home and visit my relatives who are still either working the beginning factory-type jobs in the city or still work on the farm and actually grow cotton and corn and things like that, they used to ask me, and I'll try to lapse back into my childhood accent, they say, "Granville, what you do out there at that Boeing?" And I'd say things like, well, I manage the business and technical interfaces between the Boeing Commercial Airplane Group and the various engine companies, Rolls-Royce, Pratt & Whitney, and GE. And invariably they'd say, yeah, but what you do? I finally learned to answer the question, I make airplanes. And they say, oh, you're a riveter or a welder? And I told them my job is more like welding. And so you have a lot of communication. You could hear somebody say that occasionally. Granville's got a nice job out there at Boeing in Washington State. He's a welder.
Welding relationships with the engine manufacturers was Fraser's main task. It would require all of his tact and skill to keep the engines on schedule. The first plane to go into service with United Airlines would have engines made by Pratt & Whitney. According to engineers, a modern jet engine works by a process of suck, squeeze, burn, and blow. Air flows in at the front end through a series of rotating compressors fixed to a shaft. When the air pressure has increased about 20 times, it's heated in a burner at the back. The hot air rushes out, turning the turbine blades, rotating the shaft at high speed, and spinning the front fan. This pulls the plane through the air like a propeller, except much more powerfully. The design of the new engine produced fierce technological challenges.
I don't remember how many parts there are in an engine, maybe 50,000. And they whirl in a circle with tip speeds on the fans that are transonic, with turbine materials that are running at sufficient temperatures that they're running cherry red, and they all fly in formation with the airplane. They're 25, the propulsion system, including the engines, maybe 25% of the price of an airplane. It's a big chunk of it.
There were 3 companies making engines for the 777, Rolls-Royce, GE, and Pratt & Whitney. It would be up to the airline to choose which manufacturer they went with on their airplanes. As with the rest of the plane, the engines were designed using a 3-dimensional computer. Every component stretched the limits of technology. The contours of the fan blades, for example, were angled to within 1/3 of a degree. Because the outer portions would move fastest, they would have to be larger to take in the same amount of air as the slower parts of the blades near the shaft. A steady and even airflow throughout the engine was crucial. As the core engine was designed and half a dozen prototypes built, Pratt began a test program that put the engines into test chambers where they would run for many hours under simulated flight conditions. Pratt used low-pressure altitude chambers and wind tunnels where engines could be run at full thrust in situations that simulated normal and abnormal flight. The engines would have to be able to survive the onslaught of everything from large chunks of ice to torrential rain, rain falling at the equivalent of 28 inches an hour. Bird strikes had caused crashes in the past, so the engineers fired flocks of small birds, dead ones, at the engine, escalating to birds weighing as much as 8 pounds. The more dramatic tests took place in specially constructed indoor test laboratories. But Pratt & Whitney also had an outdoor test facility for running engines for weeks at a time at high thrust. It was in a location where it wouldn't disturb the neighbors.
When you go into reverse, you kick up a lot of sand and dirt, and you just tear up the test stand. So we run it outside for that reason. That's the primary reason. And the other secondary reason is that you don't wake anybody up out here when you're running all day long.
These regular cycles of engine activity were designed to reveal problems related to fatigue or vibration that might occur once the engines had been running for a year or two in regular airline service. When an engine had to be shut down in flight, it was often because some small component had broken, leading to the plane having to land at the nearest airfield. Over 50% of engine shutdowns had nothing to do with the core engine, but were the result of failures in the sensors or tubes around the engine. During these tests, the engineers deliberately changed the distribution of weight in the engine to put it off balance. This simulated the sort of vibration an engine might experience after years of wear and tear. After regular cycles of activity, engineers went in and took the engine apart.
And then on this side here, there's two other spots.
They hoped not to find too much wrong, since these components had all been designed to resist the effects of vibration. Scott Hadley designed a drainage tube that surrounded the turbine case, attached at various points. Under certain engine conditions, the individual sections seemed to vibrate too much.
The engine, when it's running, if it has some off balance to it, such as the tire on your car, sometimes if your tire is off balance, you feel some shim in your steering wheel. And what that shim can do, shimmy, if you're at the right speed, and this tube system is tuned to that same frequency, it can amplify that vibration that's being input.
The key thing was to avoid having sections of the tube vibrate with the same frequency as the engine. Like a tuning fork, this section, in the middle of the screen, had a natural frequency that depended on its length between the brackets. By moving the position of the brackets, the designer could change the amount of vibration so the engine could no longer shake the tube apart. And as a final check, Pratt had built a rig for the engine that could vibrate it at different frequencies. With the help of a strobe light, they could catch any piece that still vibrated too much, changing the position of a bracket to damp it down. When the first engines emerged from the factory, Scott Hadley's tube and brackets were nestled in their final positions, as firm as a rock, he hoped, in spite of any vibration.
It was this fitting down here that we saw had the mode of vibration right here. And by better supporting that, we'll be able to eliminate that mode of vibration in the engine operating range.
Other engine problems occurred during regular in-service maintenance. Bad design could increase the chance of human error. So while they were still designing the engine, Pratt & Whitney opened their doors to engineers and maintenance staff from the airlines, encouraging them to swarm around the engine and look for problems. For many, it was a new experience.
I guess everybody's initial impression is the size. It's a much larger engine we've ever seen before. We have access problems. We have some problems too, even with damage with the engines mounted so low on the wing. And we've had problems in the past just with the size of the engine and accommodating in stands and engine changes, working on the engine, that sort of thing, sure.
See what I mean? So we now can't change the primary without removing the plug, which I'm not sure if that's a forward step or a backward one, really.
How do you know for sure that valve is shut?
Oh, how do you know that it's shut?
Yeah.
I think it bottoms out, doesn't it? When you turn it 270 degrees, it bottoms out.
Like, which way to turn it to open it?
This is another thing we've had trouble with over the years have been these captured fasteners. And, you know, when you're outside at midnight and it's 10 below zero and this thing falls out and goes through a sewer or something, you go try to find another one and it's not, I've always wondered why they couldn't just put a bolt in there, you know, it'd be so much simpler for us.
It was an unprecedented process and helped with the marketing of the plane, persuading potential customers that they would have a more reliable plane than ever before. By autumn 1993, the engineers had developed a high degree of confidence in the engine design. Some thought the engine was ready to fly on the 777. Others argued that ground tests were not enough. As with past engines, these new engines should first be installed on test planes, called flying test beds, so they could be tested under actual flight conditions. The arguments went back and forth.
We have not had any experience with an engine of that size, so I was in favor of a test bed, at least for this first engine, to find out after they've done their ground test and their simulation of flight in an altitude chamber, that would correlate with in-flight test data by actually flying the engine. That, I felt, would give us a good deal of confidence in the test program.
But to lease and specially adapt a test plane for several months would cost something like $10 million. Some felt it was an unnecessary expense.
We still feel that, technically speaking, we have the ability now to acquire consistent data from a wind tunnel environment, ground-based wind tunnel environment. And so we're in kind of experimenting with that possibility now with this program, in the sense that we seriously considered not having flying test beds for our engines. To be quite honest with you, I recommended we did. I recommended we were ready to do that.
Like all important decisions on the 777, everyone had his say, and then a decision gradually emerged in favor of the flying test bed.
You know, we all listened and we all talked about it, and we decided, well, you know, it's a big development program, and it's a big change, and so why don't we go check it out on the airplane, and then we'll validate that correlation between the ground facility and the flight test. And then if it turns out that it really is, we really do understand it from the ground facility, then we won't fly subsequent engines, you know, on flying test beds. So I think both people will be right, kind of.
The team began to plan the engine test flights. The plane they used had an unusual history.
The 777 engine requires a very large airplane. And basically one of the only airplanes today, a commercial airplane that can do that, is a 747. So we've used our 747 prototype airplane, which was the original 747 that was built and flown in February of 1969. We borrowed it back from the Museum of Flight, which actually is now the current owner.
The 777 engine would have twice as much thrust as the 747's regular engines. It gave an unbalanced look and feel to the historic plane.
It's like it bottoms right there. Yeah, it bottoms. That's that additional play that allows it to move on out. Probably, yeah.
As they finished fitting and checking the engine, the engineers were quietly confident that they had done all they could to give the flying test bed a smooth send-off. They were entirely unprepared for what happened next. The tests began slowly and gently, starting with lower thrust levels as the team got used to the effects of the larger engine on the plane. Then on the third flight, something unexpected happened. The dramatic explosion was something called a surge. It was similar to a car engine backfiring, and it happened because the pattern of airflow through the engine was badly disrupted.
What happens, and particularly at high power, it's very noticeable in the flight deck. It's a very large explosion that you hear. It's like a shotgun going off. Usually there's a motion in the airplane where the airplane will turn slightly into the engine that surges.
The takeoff surge that we had on RA-01 was certainly an unexpected surge. You never expect the engine to surge at its takeoff power during rotation. That's not something that you want to ever see.
The 777 was 7 months from its first flight, and Boeing and Pratt knew they had to work quickly to find the cause of the surge and fix it.
And the engine that was installed on the 747 had been through a very severe series of tests, including a number of stalls where we intentionally forced the engine to act abnormally. We had stalled this engine over 50 times before we flew on the 747. And we took away some of the goodness, some of the surge margin in that engine. So when we flew on the 747, the engine was in a degraded state. It wasn't a new representative engine, it was a damaged engine that had been worked very hard. And we got an answer from that test program that said, that's not a wise thing to do.
For many of the engineers, the surge was a setback. Alan Mullally insisted on seeing problems uncovered during testing in a positive light.
It was a gift, which was good news. It was a good piece of data. And following analysis of the engine and looking at the test data that we gathered, we realized that the case that surrounds the fan blades needed to be a little stiffer because it was moving a little bit more than what we had in the design, and that allowed a little bit too much clearance between the tip of the fan blades and the case, which allowed the fan blades to stall just like an airfoil. Now, we could have gone to flight testing on the very first airplane without this fix in, and it would have been okay, but it would be a lot more efficient if we could get the new components made, get them retrofitted, and put them on the airplane.
For the group that had supported the idea of a flying test bed, they appeared to have been right.
We had hoped they would be able to find this kind of a problem on their ground testing. It would have been one that would have more likely been found in the Florida test facility rather than the altitude chamber, because it has to be done at extremely high power. And at this point, I really don't know why they didn't find it or what the characteristics were. So, and obviously we're looking at that. But having a test bed does give you the opportunity to discover things like this.
For Ron Ostrowski, who had originally been against the idea of a flying test bed, the surge had made him think again.
In hindsight, I had a lot of advice from others, and it was good advice. Because given where we are today with what I said earlier about being somewhat behind in the schedule relative to the validation of the engines themselves, if we had not gone ahead with the flying test bed, had just made that decision on the basis of where we were a year ago, we would be concerned about our position now. We would be concerned about it.
For Davenport and the test team at Pratt, it was an unfortunate event.
We ran a test program that damaged the engine. And we got an answer in the public's eye, flying out of Boeing Field, with the 747, with some of our competitors and some of our customers observing, where the engine stalled and recovered, and we continued on the flight. But it was a very visible signature that we had to explain over and over again, first to ourselves and then to our customers, as to why it happened and why it's not representative of the production article.
Back at the Boeing factory in the middle of a midwinter night, the rest of the plane was about to undergo an important test of its fuselage called the high blow test. Once they take off, planes have to be sealed and supplied with air at a higher pressure, because at high altitudes the air gets thinner. This means that if there's a leak, air in the cabin would escape as the plane climbed, and passengers would become short of breath. In the test, engineers increased the pressure by pumping air into the passenger cabin and cargo hold, inflating the plane like a balloon. This was because on the ground, they couldn't decrease the pressure around the plane to simulate high-altitude conditions. The fuselage had to be able to withstand a pressure difference of more than 12 pounds a square inch.
We start out at 5 pounds PSI is what we go to. It's preliminary check. And then we'll come down, we'll let people out of the airplane at that point, and then we'll go up to 12.1, which is our proof test. 12.1 PSI, that's per square inch, you got to realize. You may see some leaks around doors, things like that. They're audible, very audible if they're leaking. You'll hear them. If you have a head cold, anything like that, do not enter the airplane. Anything like that. On the way up to pressure, clear your ears like this, chew gum, whatever you need. Your ears will pop. If we start going up and your ears do not pop, let us know on the radio. We'll bring it down and let you out. We don't want your ears ringing in there. No earplugs at all. It may be noisy in there, but do not wear earplugs. Okay. When we go to 12-1, I want everybody in the 26 building. I don't want them over here on this beam.
Okay, now we got contractors in, you know?
Not that I'm aware of. 2 o'clock.
Okay, FAA is here. So is customer coordination.
They were understood that they come in, they got to stand by till we're ready whenever we get ready.
Everybody's good?
Okay, so we're ready to go, right?
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead, Harold, take her up.
Everything held up under 5 pounds per square inch. Then pressure was increased toward the test limit, 50% above the maximum in-flight pressure difference.
That's a good sign. No plastic blowing.
They hoped the plane would hold a pressure difference of 12.1 pounds per square inch without leaking.
He will time the 5 minutes.
But the optimism was premature. As the pressure difference reached 12 pounds per square inch, the seal on a rear door gave way.
There it goes. See if you can hold it. We're going to try to get to 12.51 and hold. Okay, we know we're going to try to get the proof and hold it.
The engineers kept the air pumping, hoping to keep the pressure up to what was called proof, the target pressure difference.
I don't know. We're talking about it. Can't hold it? Okay, we're not going to hold proof. We're dropping it. Drop her, Harold. We were real close. Real close.
What was the airplane doing? It was climbing up?
We were climbing real good. We were climbing real good.
How high?
We were only going 1,000 feet per minute, but we were at 12.0. Then it blew.
If this starts moving out here, I mean, it rotates.
Right.
And it can rotate at this point.
Right, and then it just flops
and it's
out.
Pushing it out here.
Yeah, at a certain pressure, it'll just flop out.
What I'm saying, either way, it's going to rotate around this point here.
Let's go up and take a look.
Yeah.
Let's go up and take a look and see what we got.
The aim was to create a temporary seal for the defective door with tape and tubing so the rest of the plane could be tested.
Like I said, it's going to rotate around that point there. What we're going to do is we're going to fill this space so the seal has nowhere to go.
With what?
With Tygon tubing. It'll be trapped by the skin and it'll have nowhere to go.
Okay, let's take a break. Well, that's got air.
The temporary fix worked. And later that night, the plane was repressurized and reached 12.1 pounds per square inch without leaking. In the following weeks, the door designers were able to identify the weak point in the complex silicon rubber seal and fix it. A few days later, on a nearby airfield in the midwinter fog, John Cashman was preparing to pilot an unusual Boeing vehicle called Legos. Legos stood for Large Airplane Ground Operations Simulator. It was a cockpit on a stick, attached to a long metal framework on wheels. Its wheelbase was even longer than a standard 777's, as it was built to simulate the handling problems presented by a future version of the plane called a stretch, which would be 18 feet longer than the basic model. Because the stretch would be so big and the cockpit so far forward, Boeing engineers worried that pilots would have trouble steering it around airports, so they built Legos.
What we want to do is we'll dog leg over to the right. Is the van clear behind us? Tower Legos is now clear.
Legos ready.
And we'll go off to the right here. We'll just go off to the right here, Jim, and that's where we'll hit this 3 yellow stripes. Move to the right, yeah. And you'll eventually see 3 yellow stripes coming out of the fog here. And that will be the 3 stripes I described before.
about this heading. Head 270.
Understand.
I think they got that at Radio Shack or something.
Determined progressive taxi.
You can write a story about this lost in the fog in Lagos.
Boeing had made several attempts at solving this problem before deciding they needed Lagos.
We did try using the simulator, which is very good for a lot of things, but in ground maneuver situations, it was felt it didn't give an accurate enough picture to the pilot to really tell whether the maneuverability was acceptable. And we did do a test last year at Moses Lake using a 757 on taxiways that were scaled down in size. We actually built 60% size taxiways and taxied the 757 around that. All of those were sort of pointed to there might be a problem, or you might say they were inconclusive anyway. They didn't convince us there wasn't a problem, so we decided to go ahead and build this, which is about as close as we can get to the airplane without actually having the airplane.
One test involved video cameras mounted on the wings to show the pilot where his wheels were. Because any invention like this could give the company a competitive edge, Boeing kept the system under wraps until deciding whether or not to use it. But as the Lagos pilots addressed a problem that didn't have to be solved for another 2 years, the engine team was dealing with more pressing problems. By this time, the first flight was just 6 months away, and the 777 still didn't have a pair of engines that everyone was happy with. The surge had necessitated a complicated redesign process, all of which took time. The pressure was mounting at the weekly video conferences. The new version of the engine faced a crucial test called the blade-out test. It had to be passed before the engine would be allowed to fly.
Accelerometers in order to get the response during the blade-out event.
The fan of a big jet would rotate up to 10,000 times a minute. If a blade detached from the shaft, because of foreign object damage, for example, the engine would have to contain it, as it would do much greater damage if it smashed through the engine and into the fuselage. In the test, an explosive bolt snapped off the fan blade at high speed. The engine case was surrounded by a 3-inch thick band of extremely strong material called Kevlar. It had to stop the flying fan blade, seen here in slow motion. The impact was equivalent to stopping a 5-ton car traveling at 70 miles an hour in 5 inches.
Release the blade.
The test showed that the engine blade would be contained, but it also suggested that the unbalanced engine, now short of a fan blade, might generate a shock wave that could buckle the turbine case.
We determined that the low turbine case, which is the case on the rear of the engine that has all of the low turbine blades and vanes inside of it, needed to be increased in wall thickness to make it structurally stronger. The Flanagan brothers were in the process of machining this case for our production engines. When we went to the Flanagan brothers and said, we need to get casings that are made thicker, machined thicker, and have those casings available for the first flight of the 777, the Flanagan brothers have come to our rescue.
The knight in shining armor was Jim Flanagan. His workshop was housed in a small factory in the sleepy town of Glastonbury, Connecticut. Flanagan had been working in metal for 56 years. He started in high school producing copper fruit bowls, which he sold to local shops. His company was now being asked to produce bowls that could house jet engines. The engine cases started as roughly shaped bowls of nickel alloy, each weighing over 4,000 pounds and measuring 6 feet in diameter. When Flanagan Brothers was done, the weight would be reduced by 90%.
It requires several different fields of expertise to manufacture this part. First of all, it requires capability to turn larger diameter parts and exotic metals. This particular part is made out of a very strong material where the material will stand high degrees of heat and still not distort. It also requires drilling and milling and some exotic grinding, which is done with what they call borazon wheels. And it's not at all conventional. It's a very special type of grinding that's done on these particular parts. And we had those capabilities, and when we were quoted on the case, we were able to come up with a competitive price and good delivery.
And we are right now depending on the Flanagan brothers to get us this case so that we can have the engines built with the latest design ready to fly on the first 777. So you can kind of look at these giants in the aviation industry, the Boeing company and a little smaller giant, Pratt & Whitney and United Technologies. And it's all hanging on the Flanagan brothers and their ability to machine this case.
For Davenport at Pratt & Whitney, the new turbine case was just one of the numerous last-minute changes threatening his company's ability to deliver the engines on time.
The date is sacred, and that date happens to be April 20th. And between now and April 20th, my hair gets gray, and we get emotional.
The problems with the engine were a severe test for relationships between Pratt and Boeing and inside Boeing itself.
Sure, we had the first two engines for Airplane 1 were probably 4 weeks behind their scheduled delivery date to the Boeing company, and that's my responsibility. So I was the one that not only had to tell Granny, but I had to tell Alan. And it created a lot of problems for us. We had to do a lot of workarounds, and it disrupted a lot of our other schedules, but comes with a job.
Sometimes there's a short-term reaction where you respond to the one definition of stress. That's the terrible feeling you have when you need badly to strangle somebody to death and you can't. There is the fear that you have for a moment that the problem you've run into is unsurmountable and you won't be able to find a way through the labyrinth to get that thing done which you need to do. We get through those first two pretty quickly, and the whole team goes to work.
I think any program where you're developing something like a jet engine like this that you're going to have, it would be you'd be very fortunate to just have everything go perfect from the day you set out to do what you're going to do and never have any problems in development would be very unusual.
However, there are some of us that think it'd be fun to do that once.
Yeah, I would love to be on that program. Very much.
You're all okay? Oh, question back here.
There's a ceremonial event in the life of every new airplane that marks its coming of age. It's called the rollout. The 777 rollout would be an occasion to celebrate. Boeing had put a lot of effort into making sure the whole 777 team could take pride in the event and share the credit. Alan Mullally described the plans for the occasion to a group of managers.
And that's a Saturday. And we're going to do something that we've never done before. We're going to try to include as many of the people that have worked on the 777 around the company as possible. And usually we'd have a rollout, we'd have, 1,000 or 1,200 people. And now we're going to try to give 100,000 people a chance to see the airplane. And we've hired the people that help run Disneyland and the people movers, and we got some neat things planned, even though we can't get on the inside of the airplane, to show the inside of the airplane. You can imagine the kind of things we can do. And you're all going to get tickets. You're going to have a show time that you arrive. You're going to get personal bonding time with the airplane in addition to the show. And for those of you who've seen the airplane, it'll be an awesome experience, component level.
But Mullally's enthusiasm couldn't completely overcome the concern some felt about recent layoffs at the company. Not everyone on the 777 team would be celebrating.
Is anything being done to look at the problems, people who may be working on a design-build team facing the prospect of layoff, how their families look at, gee, great, we're all going to go to an open house and then we're not going to have any money after a while, how this affects the people?
Really thoughtful question. It's really tough. And we just got to keep going. You know, we got to keep going, staying focused on the product and doing the right thing, but it is really tough.
Is there anything special that's being looked at as far as how to deal with people to, you know, be part of the team with the prospect of them being at the bottom and being laid off?
If you have any other ideas besides the things you see that are going on, I welcome your suggestion, but the reality is that we've got to downsize.
But in the assembly building, work raced ahead on the new airplane. This first plane would only be used for test flights and would never fly for an airline, so Boeing painted it with the company colors.
Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. Soon will be. Is you gonna actually roll the plan out today or what? You know, it's a surprise because I don't know. Oh, you don't know what they're gonna do?
Either.
Yeah, sir.
I don't know what they're gonna do exactly. I don't know whether they're gonna roll it out or just unveil it or what.
If it's anything like they've been in the past, it's gonna be.
50,000 Boeing employees and their relatives were invited to the rollout ceremony. Included was Glenda Barnes. Her job had been to put sealing compound around the inside of the plane's fuel tanks.
To get into the gate.
What you told me to get my badge?
Because one ticket and one badge. A Boeing badge must be escorted with one ticket.
I got the Boeing fever.
It's time to go. Got Boeing fever now,
I got
huh?
Boeing fever.
Over and over during the course of the day, thousands of people were brought by bus to the factory where the plane was revealed. As the plane was unveiled, it looked deceptively small. In reality, it was only slightly smaller than a 747.
Which is side of the body of the plane, which is here, all the way out is what I work on. I'm inside of there. See those holes that's underneath there, those little round holes? We go in and out of those, seal all the way up and down the wing of it.
Go in and out of those up in there?
That's the excess holes. That's how you get in and out. No, you just have a radio with you. And the sealers go in and out of there and do all the sealing. It's hard to get in there and sometimes hard to get out because that's little small holes. That's the first thing I looked at when they undid the curtains was the wings. I wanted to see exactly what they look like. To just imagine all the stuff that I'd done inside of there.
I think the expression sort of is, oh wow, and you can't help but get tears in your eyes. Everybody I talked to had the same reaction.
Yeah, get it in their eyes.
Quite a moment.
Yeah, it really is.
It's a real draining experience to build an airplane. So I think everyone is ready now, and we're ready to go fly it.
So it was thrilling, having worked on the airplane since the start, to see this all culminate here.
Not as thrilling as it will be at the beginning of June.
When we see the airplane lift off, it'll be a big relief. When we see it land, it'll be an even bigger relief.
Late that night, the first 777 left the hangar for its true rollout, observed by only a handful of workers. In 2 months' time, this plane would take off for the first time. Before that, it would be fueled and the engines run. Then all its major systems would be tested on the ground. These days before the first flight were still being overshadowed by layoffs. At his regular staff meeting, Alan Mullally tried to soften the blow.
And that is we are redeploying some really key members of our team. And when you see them, give them a hug, you know, because it's really hard. You know how hard it would be on us and what we think when we change jobs and stuff. But just like in this last week, the ones that Larry and Ron announced, like Creel, this is his last day today, you can write him a note or something, you know?
The 777 was by this time only 1 day away from its first flight. There was one more test to be done on the ground, the high-speed taxi test.
You know, we have it's a pretty thorough look-through within the low-speed range of all the configurations it can fly in. So from that standpoint, we're really trying to get a very quick overview of the entire airplane, how it handles, how the systems work, stuff like that.
Just before the plane was to taxi, there was a ritual walk down the runway that anyone could join in. It was a search for any small object that might fly up and damage the plane.
We're doing a little FOD walk, looking for foreign objects that could damage our engine. And obviously that wouldn't be acceptable. So we have a bunch of volunteers, novices, walking down the ramps, everybody, great intentions, and it all helps. Anything could be ingested. Right now, we don't want to take a chance to damage the blades at all or the compressors.
Okay, we've got left and right engine started. We're reviewing our status messages. Sweeps will be coming up here in a moment.
The plane would taxi down the runway, approaching takeoff speed before putting on the brakes. But as the engines began to turn, there was a problem.
All stations, this is 777-1. We've had a hydraulic leak on the left side of the airplane, and we've shut down and are opening doors here to investigate. Stand by here for an estimate of how long we're going to be.
There was a leak in the hydraulic power system that moved the huge flaps on the wings.
Yeah.
Although there were several backup systems, it had to be fixed before they could taxi. When they finally got going, one key test would be to see how the plane responded if crosswinds pushing on the plane's tail created a sideways pressure on the nose landing gear. Cashman came down to discuss this with Mullally while they waited for the leak to be fixed.
With a yaw, and then I'm only going to wait a couple seconds, maybe one,
is it coming
before
down,
I hit the brain brakes again.
Is it coming down with the yaw for
side load?
But for them to check side loads, or for you to check what it feels like on landing?
No, for them.
For them.
It's to try to induce shimmy on the nose gear.
From
at high speed, they want to spin up with a side load and to see if it shimmies. And that's part one. And part two is with just hit the brakes, and with one brake deactivated, that puts a torque on the gear, and they can look for shimmy stability on the main gear also.
Oh,
and we're trying to do that on one run.
Oh, that's neat.
Because once we get off that condition, I got to use almost max brakes
to get stopped. Why don't they do it with a rudder input or a wheel input? You can't do it at the high speed.
It is a rudder input.
The cause of the leak was discovered, a small rubber O-ring that was pinched at the junction point, leaving a gap for hydraulic fluid to leak through. The O-ring was replaced, the engine started up again, and the crew went through their final routines. Under its own steam, the first 777 made a quick right turn and headed for the runway.
South on Alpha down to set up by where the crash truck is this side of Bravo.
These taxi tests would check the operation of the landing gear, the heating of the brakes, and the stability of the whole plane. John Cashman would take the plane up to 140 knots, lifting the nose off the ground. Any faster and the plane would take off, an event that was supposed to wait until the following day. But at peak speed on the taxi, there was a surprise. It appeared for a moment that all the plane's wheels had left the ground. Had first flight been a day early?
Okay, well,
what do you
now,
say?
let's repeat in unison. First flight is tomorrow.
Yeah,
tomorrow.
It didn't happen today.
It did not happen today.
Okay, we're going to taxi southbound and let's see where we are on the temps here. We'll be able to put a few people on at the south end and then taxi up back to the runway. Radio car, what copies?
They would then try and work out how to retrieve it. But anyway.
For the journey back to the stand, Cashman invited a handful of senior executives to take their first ride in the plane. It was a journey of less than half a mile, all on the ground. Still, they were thrilled.
What? Rudy, why don't you passengers out here? We're all aboard. Let's come aboard. It sounds like a flight attendant, too. They replaced them all. The sensor, huh?
At the briefing after the tests, Cashman reported on how the plane had done. He finished up with a problem all too familiar to anyone with a car: noisy brakes.
No, this happens every time you get probably above 3 to 4. It's kind of a grindy, low groan is just before you stop.
Thank you, everybody. It was a good test. Thank you very much. I think we're there. We can't test any more on the ground. That's great.
There was no disguising the impatience of the team. The day they'd been working towards for 4.5 years had almost arrived. The next day, Boeing's prototype 777 was scheduled to fly for the first time. The plane would be checked and rechecked through the night. For in the course of this $5 billion enterprise, this flight would be a milestone like no other. Success or failure would be riding on it.